Nineveh, over 3,000 years ago, the law did not whisper, it carved. And what it carved was not justice but hierarchy. A wife was not a woman, she was obedience in flesh. When she disobeyed, the law did not call for a conversation, it called for rope and witnesses and whips. The street became the court, the market became the sentence, and silence became the only safe language for women like her. She was 17. Her name was Ishara, and her punishment would not be delivered behind closed doors, it would be delivered in front of the world. She heard the footsteps before she saw the rope. The sun had just begun to melt the shadows off the clay walls when Beli returned, not with bread or words, but with a priest. Ishara stood in the doorway, her hands still smelling of ash from the morning fire. She did not bow, that was her second mistake. The first had been yesterday, when she interrupted him in front of the commander's wife. A small correction that was all it had been, but pride, in men like Beli, was more sacred than God's. The priest did not greet her. He murmured something in Akkadian and unrolled a scroll made of hardened clay. She was not asked if she understood it. Her husband took her wrist as if it belonged to someone else and tied the rope with careful knots, not out of cruelty, but tradition. The knot sat like a scar against her skin. A single tug would make her follow. That was the law. Ishara looked toward the neighbor's window. It closed. The courtyard that was always full of voices fell still. No one wanted to be a witness, and yet everyone would be. Her feet scraped the earth as he led her through the alley, the rope swaying between them like an unspoken truth. Dogs barked. Dust rose. Children paused their games. The city gate stood open, its stone lions watching with their mouths forever parted, as if they had tried to speak once but gave up. She remembered when Beli first brought her through those gates, 4 years ago, when she was 13, and still believed that being chosen was a form of safety. Now the same gate would lead her to her sentence, not for theft, not for betrayal, but for defiance, the kind that blooms only in words. At the edge of the market, she saw the whipping post. 2 wooden beams, stained darker in the center. Beside it, a bench. Beside the bench, a pot of oil and a ceremonial cloth. The priest walked ahead to prepare the ritual. Beli stayed close, but silent. He had not raised his voice since yesterday. He did not need to. The rope did the speaking now. Ishara kept walking, not because she accepted it, but because the law did not ask for her acceptance, only her presence. The priest did not look at her when he read the law. He looked at the stone wall behind her, as though the words were meant only for it. Ishara stood with the rope still around her wrist, now tied to a wooden pole just outside the gate where the elders sat. 5 men, old enough to forget mercy, young enough to enjoy the weight of judgment. They leaned forward, not to listen to her, but to hear the priest recite the rule. Middle Assyrian law, tablet 40. If a wife defied her husband's word, and if the man brought his case before the council, then he was within his right to strike her publicly, without guilt, and with witnesses to preserve the honor of discipline. The priest paused between lines, letting each sentence thud like a stone. Ishara opened her mouth once, just once, to say that she had not meant to shame him, that her words had been gentle. But Beli did not flinch. He had already made his offering to the gods this morning. This punishment had been sanctified. One elder raised his hand slightly, asking only if the whip would be blessed before use. The priest nodded. A servant girl, perhaps 10 years old, brought forward a shallow clay bowl with oil and myrrh. She did not look at Ishara either. No one did. That was part of it. To look would be to remember she was human. To avoid looking meant the ritual could continue without interruption. Ishara felt the wind pull at her sleeves. Her hands trembled, but her spine stayed straight. She would not kneel, not yet, not before the lash. 2 guards approached and began to untie her from the post, then fasten her to the carrying beam used for livestock. 1 on each arm, stretched wide, not to harm her, only to prepare her. The law allowed no blood. That was the rule. Pain was acceptable. Blood was not. She was not a criminal, they reminded themselves. Only a wife. And the punishment was not about anger. It was about order. Ishara stared at the dust beneath her feet as they led her down the path toward the central square. Her sandals had come loose, and now the stones bit into her heels. She did not cry. That too was part of the discipline to withhold the weakness they wanted to see. Belly walked behind her, whip in hand. It was braided leather, coiled with ceremonial beads. A gift from a cousin in Ashur. It had never been used. Until now. Ishara wondered how many other wives had walked this path before her. How many had spoken a word too boldly. How many had remembered the sting of law more clearly than the touch of love. She would not ask. The law did not care for questions, only for silence, and steps that followed orders. The market did not pause for her. Clay sellers called their prices. Butchers slammed cleavers through bone. Smoke curled from the bread stalls, thick with the smell of sesame and ash. And at the center of it all stood the whipping post, a beam of dark wood lashed with ancient stains, its base worn smooth by sandals and knees. Ishara was led there by the guards, her arms still held apart like a gate opening to judgment. Belly walked 10 steps behind, not rushing. Punishment was a procession. It had to be seen. That was the point. The priest arrived first and laid out the tools. A folded cloth, a small jar of oil, the whip, coiled like a sleeping serpent beside the bench. 2 elder merchants stopped mid-haggle and moved to watch. One licked his thumb and cleaned a fig seed from his nail. Another shaded his eyes and squinted, as though she were a far-off prize. Children whispered behind pottery stands. A woman drew her daughter close and turned her away. Ishara was untied from the beam only to be tied again, this time with her arms above her head, fastened to the wooden post. Her red tunic fell loose from her shoulders. The priest stepped forward and anointed her back with oil, not to bless, to preserve the skin. The law forbade open wounds. She must be bruised, not broken. She must return home able to walk, to serve, to kneel. She must remember, but not be ruined. Belly took the whip from the bench. He uncoiled it slowly, like a man unwrapping memory. His face was unreadable, not hatred, not pity, only duty. He raised the whip, paused, and brought it down across her back, with a sound like a curtain snapping in the wind. She flinched, but did not cry out. The priest counted softly, one hand raised. The second strike came faster, then the third. By the 5th, the market was quiet. Even the sellers had stopped. Pain gathered in her lungs like smoke. Her breath came shallow. The oil stung where the whip landed, and each strike folded her into herself. But she did not scream. She would not give them that. Blood was forbidden, but shame was required. Her hair clung to her face in the heat. Her knees shook. The priest held up both hands. The punishment was complete. Belly lowered the whip and stepped back. No one cheered. No one wept. The law had been satisfied. Ishara remained tied for a moment longer, as if the post needed time to release her. Then the guards cut the rope. She fell to her knees. Dust clung to her skin, and the marketplace returned to motion. The noise resumed. The bread was sold, the fig seeds forgotten. Ishara rose slowly, not because she was ready, but because she had no choice. The silence afterward was not kindness, it was warning. Ishara walked home behind Bailey, her head low, steps measured, arms hanging like cloth from her shoulders. No one stopped them, no one spoke. The market did not forget her, it simply pretended not to see. At the alleyway, a dog followed them briefly, then turned away, as if sensing something cursed. Inside the courtyard, the stones still held the sun's warmth. Her knees gave way beneath her, but she caught herself against the wall. Belly did not look back. He placed the whip on a hook near the door and washed his hands in a basin. He said nothing. That was the cruelty of it, not the lash, but the calm. He would not mention it. He would not touch her. He would eat alone, as if the punishment had emptied something in him too. Ishara sat in the shade of the garden wall. The pomegranate tree leaned heavy with fruit but dropped nothing. Her back throbbed in waves. Not from bleeding the oil had done its work, but from the weight of being seen. She had not wept. Not during. Not after. But now the ache curled inside her like breath held too long. A neighbor passed by the gate and did not glance in. A girl who once shared figs with her by the well walked past with a water jar, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Ishara was no longer part of the living rhythm of the street. She had become a caution, a name to whisper to daughters, a gesture wives would mimic behind closed doors when their husbands' tempers stirred. She was what happened when silence was broken. When evening came, the house filled with smoke from the hearth. She lit the lamp, set the bread to rise, and crushed lentils into paste. Her hands did not tremble. They worked without thought. That was the lesson. A wife must continue. A wife must endure. She must learn to carry pain as if it were incense, invisible but constant. When Belly finally spoke, it was only to ask for water. She brought it. He drank. The whip still hung on the wall like a scroll unrolled. She wondered if he would use it again, if her voice had left a stain that could not be scrubbed clean. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. She heard the owl outside, the creak of rope from a pulley left hanging, the hush of sandals on faraway paths. But no wind came, no voice rose, no comfort followed, only the silence, not soft, not forgiving, just wide, just empty, just there. The next morning, Ishara rose before the lamps burned out. The air still clung to the cold of night, and the silence had not lifted from her bones. She wrapped her shawl over her back, though it hurt to do so, and began her duties as if nothing had happened. That was the expectation. That was the rhythm of obedience. The punishment was not meant to stop her, only to fold her more neatly into her place. She ground barley with aching arms, swept the floor in short, careful strokes, and stirred lentils until they softened into paste. The marks across her skin bloomed darker beneath her robe, but none would ask to see them. Visibility was for punishment, not for healing. The law that carved her life was not hidden in the shadows of power. It was written plainly, on tablets older than her father's grave. The Middle Assyrian laws spelled out every rule a wife must obey, every correction a man could deliver. If she left the house without permission, he could seal her inside for days. If she uncovered her head, he could disfigure her as a warning. If she raised her voice, even once, before men of higher standing, he could strip her dignity in front of the marketplace, and it would not be called cruelty. It would be called order. Ishara had been taught these laws like lullabies, not in song, but in silence, in the way her mother lowered her gaze before her father, in the way her aunt returned from her own punishment without ever speaking of it again, in the way the older women tightened their belts and pressed their mouths into lines whenever a girl reached marriageable age. It was not spoken, but it was known. Her thoughts turned to the clay tablets she once glimpsed in the scribe's quarters, heavy, lined with cuneiform like teeth pressed into stone. She wondered who had written them, if the man who first etched those laws into earth had a wife of his own, if she had dared to ask him why he believed that obedience was more sacred than kindness. Ishara's fingers shook as she poured water into a basin. Her reflection rippled, her face unrecognizable in the shifting light. She was 17, but she felt older than the gods. Outside, a bell rang from the temple courtyard. A wedding, perhaps, or a festival. Another girl being given to another man, with prayers and promises and whispers too quiet to question. Ishara did not attend. She stayed behind, folding linens, braiding her hair, preparing the midday meal. She moved like a ghost, pressed between walls, not unseen, but untouchable. She had spoken once, and the law had answered. Now her life was quieter, her steps shorter, her breath slower. That was the power of the law, not to kill, but to shape, to carve a woman into silence until she no longer remembered the sound of her own defiance. Years passed, but time in Nineveh did not move forward. It only circled, like a tethered beast pacing the same worn earth. Ishara's back healed, but the memory stayed tender beneath her skin, a map of quiet bruises no one could see. The whip no longer hung by the door. It had been placed inside a chest, folded beside a soldier's cloak, yet its shadow still divided the house. Belai grew older, slower, quieter. He no longer raised his hand, but he did not have to. The law had already done his work for him. Ishara obeyed before command was given. She spoke only when spoken to. The house stayed clean, the bread unburned, the silence complete. When her daughter was born, she named her Ishtar, not for rebellion, but for protection. A name whispered to a goddess might make the gods look away. The girl had her mother's dark eyes and her father's patience. Ishara taught her how to grind grain without complaint, how to bow with grace, how to smile when spoken to, how to hide her thoughts behind lowered lashes. She did not tell her why. Some lessons are carried through tone, not words. Years later, when the child reached womanhood, the city's laws had not changed. The clay tablets still slept in their archives, and men still quoted them like scripture. Ishara watched her daughter from the courtyard one evening, the lamplight trembling in her hair. She looked so much like herself before the rope, before the marketplace, before the oil that sealed her silence. Ishara wanted to warn her, to tell her that obedience is not virtue when it is forced, that fear is not devotion when it is written into law. But her tongue felt heavy with the weight of generations. Instead, she said only, "Remember to be still." The girl nodded. The same nod Ishara once gave her own mother. The same nod that carried all the sorrow of women who had learned that surviving was its own kind of defiance. When night came, Ishara stepped outside. The air was warm and thick with dust. In the distance, she could hear the drums from the temple, the chants for a god of storms who demanded loyalty above all. She wondered if the gods were ever beaten into silence too. The moon glowed pale across the rooftops, the same moon that had watched her punishment, her marriage, her years of quiet endurance. Ishara closed her eyes and let the memory of her voice return, not the scream they wanted, but the word she had spoken long ago, the word that had cost her everything. No law could erase that sound, not truly. It lived where whips could not reach. It was small, but it was hers. She was never meant to be remembered, but you remember her now. If you believe stories like Ishara's still matter, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I read them all.